I went with Lorraine and our kids a couple of weeks ago, Queen's birthday weekend, to an exhibition downtown at the Princess Wharf. I don't know if any of you have heard about this exhibition or maybe seen it. The Body Worlds exhibition. It's a remarkable display of these real human bodies, preserved, but real human bodies and body parts. Some of them healthy and looking really vital and beautiful, some of them very diseased and looking very sick. Has anyone been there? Has anyone seen the exhibition? Hands up. No? I haven't. Cultured lot. We went because some friends recommended it to us, and it was really quite stunning. A celebration of the human body, the wonder of the human body. But along with that, this particular exhibition is deliberately trying to highlight the dynamics of disease in the human body and the kinds of practices that are necessary for us to remain healthy, to inoculate our bodies against disease. Here's a few photos that I took. These are real human bodies, but preserved through the process of plastination. Next slide. There you go, the internal organs, some lungs that aren't looking particularly healthy, something else on the right there. You might want to keep moving. Lungs that are healthy, lungs that are unhealthy, and a diseased heart. Well, Paul, in this famous passage from 1 Corinthians, he likens the church to a human body, and in particular to a sick body, a diseased body. And I can't help but remember the sermon that Paul Windsor preached about 20 years ago on this passage here in this chapel, because I play it every year to my introduction to preaching class. And it is ingrained in my mind. And I came to this passage, studied it, and I've just got his words ringing in my ears. And one of the things he has done with this passage is to highlight the fact that it is very much as if Paul is saying this body, this church in Corinth is diseased, it's sick. And so I'm going to run with that metaphor because I can't shake it out of my head. So I hope that's okay. And there are two conditions that Paul particularly identifies here, which he also then goes on to prescribe a cure for. The first condition is in verse 15. Look at the dialogue in the text. That's the clue. Verse 15. Now, if the foot should say, because I am not a hand, I do not belong to the body, it would not for that reason stop being part of the body. If the ear should say, because I am not an eye, I do not belong to the body, it would not for that reason stop being part of the body. So some parts of the body are saying to other parts of the body, or looking at other parts of the body and thinking, I don't belong. I don't belong. What's going on here? Well, Paul was not the first person to use this metaphor of the body to describe a community. It was a really common rhetorical device used by political theorists and politicians back in that day. But one of the best known examples comes from the 5th century. And this chap here up on the screen, Senator Menenius Agrippa, he used this image to persuade the lower class plebeians in his world to stop rioting and striking and to pull their heads into line and to honour appropriately the higher class patricians who were located above them in the social hierarchy. This is actually a very famous, well-known speech that he gave, and I'm going to paraphrase it for you, almost word for word. And this is how it goes. He says this: imagine a body, here he is in the Senate addressing the people. Imagine a body in which all the parts unite against the stomach. If the foot should say, I carry the body's weight, and the hand should say, I procure the body's provisions, and the mouth should say, I chew the body's food, and then they were all together to say to the stomach, and what do you do? What do you do for us? Nothing. You require us to do all these things, to feed you, to serve you, and you do nothing in return. It's not fair, we're going on strike. What would happen? Agrippa said. The entire body, all the members of that body, would weaken and starve and die. Because, he said, the stomach is not just nourished by the parts of the body, it in turn distributes what it receives to every member of the body as it is needed. And so by identifying the patricians with the stomach, he was defending the existing social hierarchy. In ancient Rome, you had this very, very hierarchical system divided into two basic divisions, the honestiores, those who by virtue of education, wealth, status, connections were high status, and the humiliores, all those people who were low status. And Paul is suggesting here that these kinds of divisions, these kinds of distinctions, these kinds of hierarchies have infected the church in Corinth. And some people, low-class Christians, second-class Christians, are looking up at those first-class Christians who exercise the higher gifts, who enjoy the deeper experiences of the Spirit. And they're thinking, we don't belong. They're feeling a little bit like my 15-year-old daughter Emma, who about a week ago told me with quivering lip and quavering voice that her little group of friends at school, her group, are now apparently hanging out on the weekends together, and they're not inviting her. Punks. These second-class Christians in Corinth feel like that. They're feeling excluded. They're feeling insignificant. And you could call this condition "we don't belong-itis." It's rampant in churches, not just in the first century, but today. I mean, when elderly people struggle through worship services built entirely around contemporary worship for young people, they quite reasonably conclude, we don't belong here. When single people experience ministry structures that are designed for families with children, they quite reasonably conclude, we don't belong here. When social welfare beneficiaries observe leaders in the church giving a disproportionate amount of their time and attention to high net worth individuals, they quite reasonably conclude, we don't belong here. When left-leaning Christians are told by their communities, because of their position on a particular issue, that they do not take the Bible seriously and they don't take the gospel seriously and they are barely Christian, they quite reasonably conclude, we don't belong here. We don't belong-itis is a deadly disease. And it's affecting the church in New Zealand, Aotearoa. But Paul says there's an antidote. There is a cure. Look at me. Look at me. Look at me at verse 17. Paul says this. He says, if the whole body were an ear, where would the sense of hearing be? If the whole body, were an eye, where would the sense of hearing be? If the whole body were an ear, where would the sense of smell be? The cure to this condition, he says, is to recognize that diversity in the body is essential. The body is made up of a variety of different parts, each of them essential, each of them with a unique function for the health of the body. And the Corinthians in ancient Corinth, they knew this, that church. You realise ancient Corinth was the home of the temple of Asclepius, the Greek god of healing. And up on the screen there you'll see Asclepius in all his glory. And in that temple there were hundreds and hundreds of terracotta models of diseased and deformed and sick body parts. And a worshipper in that temple would take one of these terracotta model body parts and would present it to the god with the desperate plea that he would heal their body part that was represented by this model. I mean, they knew that every part of the body is significant to our well-being. And Paul says God designed it that way. Look at verse 18. God has placed the parts in the body, every one of them, just as he wanted them to be. That's wonderful news. Over the last several months, I have at times, perhaps understandably, compared myself to Charles Hewlett, my predecessor as principal here. And thanks, Nerily, for constantly reminding me about Charles and how wonderful he is. Charles is so creative. You know, if you know him, so creative, and he's so pastoral, and he's so insightful. He is so wise, and he's so thoughtful, yes. And he's so funny. Amen. He's so much better than me. There have been times when I felt a little bleak. To be honest. Do you ever find yourself comparing pairing yourself with someone else in the body of Christ, their gifts, their experience of the Spirit. Paul would say, through this text to us, stop it! God has placed you where you are, exactly where you are in the body of Christ for a reason. Your experiences, your tragedies, your temperament, your limitations, your passions, they are needed by those around you. God has placed you there with all of those attributes for a reason. You have a unique function to play in the body of Christ, both here in this expression of the body at Carey, but elsewhere in your churches and in the wider body. Diversity in the body is essential. But there's a second conflict, there's a second condition in afflicting this body. In verse 21, Paul says, the eye cannot say to the hand, I don't need you. And the head cannot say to the feet, I don't need you. So if some parts of the body are feeling inferior and insignificant, other parts are feeling superior and self-sufficient. Which parts? Which parts? The head and the eyes. That's interesting because in ancient political rhetoric, the head and the eyes represented the leaders, the heads of state. And the hands and the feet, they represented the labouring classes, the foot soldiers. The language is carried down to our day. And Paul is implying here that the leaders in the church in Corinth, by the way they are behaving, are saying to the weaker members of those churches, we don't need you. We don't need you. You could call this condition, we don't need you, Enza. And I've just coined a new term. And it's spreading through many churches in Aotearoa today. We all wrestle with this. When pastors see themselves as CEOs with a special link to the Spirit, who can download to their churches instructions without first listening to the members of Christ's body, they are saying to their congregations, we don't really need you. When Pākehā elders in flourishing multi-ethnic congregations persistently refuse to appoint Chinese or Korean or Polynesians to leadership roles, they are saying to those ethnic minorities in their churches, we don't really need you. When the leaders of strong churches generally ignore the weaker churches down the road, or the weaker churches overseas, they are saying to that part of the body of Christ, we don't need you. When academics or theological college students arrogantly dismiss Pentecostal believers because of their unrefined theology, they are saying to a part of the body of Christ, we don't need you. Anthony Thistleton, in his commentary on this book, he calls this the sin of autonomy, the characteristic sin of our age, of the secular world. And it's got into the church, and it's maiming the church. So again, what's the antidote? Paul prescribes a cure for this, and he does it in verse 22. He says this, those parts of the body that seem to be weaker are indispensable, and the parts that we think are less honourable we treat with special honour. And he goes on in that vein. The cure for this condition, he's saying here, is to recognise that the dispensable parts of the body are actually the most indispensable. You think about it, he refers there to the tender inner organs, the supposedly weak and forgotten parts of the body. They're indispensable. I mean, you can live without an eye, but you can't live without a liver. And then he goes on euphemistically to refer to the private sexual organs of the body. And he's saying they might not be much to look at, but they're absolutely crucial. They carry the function of reproduction, and so we treat them with special honour. We give them special treatment. And again, he goes on, follow the logic, verse 24. He says, again, God designed it that way. God has put the body together, and the word there is, has composed the body, crafted the body, giving greater honour to the parts that lacked it, so that there should be no division in the body. Do you see what Paul's doing here? with this metaphor of the body? instead of using it to defend and preserve the existing status hierarchies of our world, he is completely upending those hierarchies with the use of this metaphor. The metaphor that Agrippa used to make sure that the weak kept serving the strong. Paul is using it to say that in the church it should be different. The strong are to serve the weak. And if anyone is to receive special treatment, it should be those who are forgotten, those who are ignored, those who are generally regarded as dispensable. I love the story of Joseph Doak from the annals of New Zealand church history. He was the pastor of Oxford Terrace Baptist Church back in the late 19th century. And this was a church that had a Bible class for Chinese immigrants. And at a time when, in New Zealand society, the Chinese immigrants were really regarded with considerable prejudice. You take a look at the screen here. Newspapers often railed against the yellow peril, the curse of the Chow. And our leading politicians sometimes referred to Chinese as animals. They compared them to primates. Take a look there. Richard Seddon. Well, way back one Sunday night in June 1899, the police in Christchurch raided a Chinese gambling den. And they arrested 32 Chinese and 4 Europeans, and they charged them with being unlawfully on premises for the purpose of illegal gambling. And they threw them into the police prison cells, big enough barely for half that number of people, and left them there to sleep overnight in mud with one blanket for every 4 or 5 men. 6 of the people arrested were members of Oxford Terrace's Chinese Bible class. And when the pastor of that church, J.J. Doak, when he heard that this had happened, he immediately went to the police and requested bail for those 6 men. The police refused initially because they said, these Chinese people all look the same, and if we release them, we'll never be able to identify them again. Doak persisted, and eventually they were all granted bail, except the Chinese men had to pay £25 bail. The Europeans only had to pay £5 bail. Well, that Doak didn't let the matter rest there. He followed it up with a sermon the next Sunday, with public meetings. He wrote to the newspapers, urging for a government inquiry, and he got one. The government looked into this, and it resulted in disciplinary action for the offending police officers. And those police cells, the prison cells, were pulled down and rebuilt so that they would be more humane for those that might be incarcerated there. Now, we've forgotten that story. New Zealand doesn't remember that story, but for a moment in time, those that were watching in Christchurch and around New Zealand, they got a glimpse of the body of Christ in action. One of my most wonderful memories of pastoral ministry concerns a man called Bert. He was a member of the music team at our church, and he was 85 years old. Played the mandolin. And one day, his beloved wife of 60 years passed away, and he was obviously devastated. And his little stall over by the organ, it was empty the next Sunday, and the Sunday after that. And I was thinking, I need to follow up Bert after the initial pastoral care and the funeral. I need to get to visit Bert. Before I got to visit Bert, news came to me that the young adults in the church's music team, a number of them, had gone around to Bert's place, taking the musical instruments so that they could have a jam session with old Bert to try and lift his spirits. A bunch of young, strong 20-somethings caring for an old, frail man in his 80s. That's the body of Christ in action. Christ embodied. Look, I've got to finish. Sam is going to be at me if I don't. But let me finish with the McCrindle report. I don't know if you've seen this. It's just come out last month. A really interesting and I think quite significant report on faith and belief in New Zealand. Significant because it brings together evidence to confirm what we have intuitively known. that for most Kiwis, one of the main reasons why they are not interested in the Christian faith is the church. To quote the report, abusive behaviour in the church, judgmental attitudes in the church, authoritarian leadership in the church. The church in Aotearoa is crippled in many places by the very kinds of divisions and hierarchies that afflicts our wider society. Church is sick. And so we shouldn't be surprised that it doesn't grow like it could. What's the antidote? Well, one antidote, Paul would tell us from this passage, is to recognise God's design for the body. And if we do that, it will mean respecting those who are different and honouring those who are discounted. Who in your communities are generally ignored, generally discarded, generally scoffed at, generally forgotten? Pay them special attention, Paul says. And the church will be distinctive. And as we become more and more distinctive, we'll become more and more attractive. Amen.